Hey, it's Dr. Tom. Today, I'm being joined by my good friend, Dr. Cleopatra Kamperveen of the Fertility and Pregnancy Institute. You might be asking yourself, what the heck are you doing talking to a fertility specialist when what you're doing is primarily, chronic Lyme disease and other chronic infections, talking a lot about COVID-19, and what do they have to do with each other? Well, today you're going to find out there's a lot more overlap than you would think. There's so much about how to uplift our human experience, how to change our genetics expression, how to modify epigenetics, and really make a huge change in the world. One of the most important things we're also going to talk about is the current events. Dr. Cleopatra is from North Africa in Egypt, and she has had she's got this amazing hair that really lets her stand out, and this amazing personality, but she's gone through a lot, and she's going to be really talking as a person of color about what her experience has been and ways that we can all come together during the crazy times that are happening right now to really uplift everyone and to support all people at the same time. And honestly, the conversation went to places I would have never imagined. I mean, I felt like I went through 4 or 5 different therapy sessions, and really it made such a huge difference. So I hope it's wonderfully helpful for you. Check it out. This is definitely one where you're going to want to stay till the end. I mean, this is such one of the most heartfelt conversations I think I've ever had, and I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Let's dive in. Hey, Dr. Cleopatra, thanks so much for joining me today. It's so great to see you.
So good to see you, Dr. Tom. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for making the time. I mean, this is so great to have a chance to sit down and chat. And for anybody who doesn't know, I mean, Dr. Cleopatra is just wildly energetic and such a force of nature. I mean, it's like, we were talking right before we went on about her mission statement about, there's so many things you're doing, but this whole part about magnifying love and goodness in the world just really hits home with me. And I know that there's so much more about what you do, but anybody who approaches science and wisdom from a place of love is definitely a pal of mine. So
yes,
and it's so much fun. Thanks for joining us. What's going on?
So good to be here. So much is going on. We have a lot going on at the Fertility and Pregnancy Institute, helping our mamas trimester and get ready for their babies epigenetically and in every way. And we have so much happening in our world right now, so much coming to the surface. We are slowly opening back up in the wake of coronavirus, and really coronavirus is still happening, and we're still monitoring and seeing what the consequences of reopening is going to be in terms of the impact of coronavirus. And here we are at a point in our history in America where we both live, Tom, where racial injustice is coming to the surface. It's not that it's been happening recently, right? Only it's been happening for 400 years in this country, but there have been some highly publicized, really terrible incidents that have happened that have sparked widespread protests in the United States and throughout the world. And it's been really beautiful to see the way people are stepping up and how our brothers and sisters all over the world are standing up and speaking up on behalf of Americans and Black Americans. So there's a lot up right now in the world and in our mission.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's so many things that I want to talk about because it's interesting to me that the way you go about fertility and pregnancy is so much aligned with the core values of how I help people to recover from chronic illness. But I think you really bring up one of the things we really need to talk about first is because so much of what's going on in our world, whether it's spoken or unspoken, affects our health, both physically, mentally, and spiritually. And so I've heard so much, I don't want to forget to say this because my daughter, goes to a school. Thankfully, we're exposed to all races and really everybody living and loving together. But one of her favorite movies is Harriet. And my wife and her went out to see this in Boston when it opened, and they were the only white people in the audience. Mm-hmm. And what's really interesting is So this is something that we talk about openly in our family, but I mean, we are as white as it gets here. And what I've heard a lot of on social media is that, you know, everybody enjoys the support, but we need to have a voice from the Black community. And I just want you to talk about, especially since a lot of people will be listening only, is about your background and what really is, where do you come from, where you have sort of a personal experience that's valuable for people to listen to, not just somebody who's in love with the world, but
Yeah.
what's your background?
Thank you for asking that question because it's really important. So I'm an Egyptian American. My parents came to the United States a few years before I was born. So I think of myself as an immigrant, even though I was born in Brooklyn. And it's really interesting because a lot of times people don't realize that people from the Middle East are African, but Egypt is in Africa. And if you see me, I look like what you would think a Black American, but a light-skinned Black American looks like maybe someone who's biracial. I actually am 99% Egyptian. I've done 23andMe, so I'm actually not biracial. I'm 1% Ashkenazi Jewish in terms of
No
my
way.
DNA. So I guess in that sense I am, but I am Egyptian. So if you see me, you understand that I have the experiences of a woman of color, of a person of color. And what's even more important to know is that my 27-year-old mother died in childbirth, giving birth
Oh my God.
to me and to my twin sister in 1978 in the United States. And she was a beautiful young woman. We are her third and fourth children. So she has 4 children. And her death was largely the result of institutional racism. She received poor medical care. She was a woman of color. She was a new American. Our family didn't have health insurance. My mother didn't speak English very well, if at all. I've never heard her speak, so I don't
Oh
know.
man.
But what I know is that her death was entirely preventable, and she died because her life wasn't valued. And that is so hard for people to understand, that actually happened in this country, and that still today in 2020, almost 42 years after I was born, goes on every day. And it was really that beginning to life that made me obsessed with moms and women who would one day become moms and try to figure out how to make the world a healthier and happier and more loving and supportive place for women and their children, and women of every background. And I'm so proud to say that our zone of genius at the Fertility and Pregnancy Institute is what we call the primester, the time leading up to pregnancy, when it's really one of the most important and valuable
Yeah.
windows of opportunity we will ever have as human beings, because we can literally shape the quality and expression of the genes that we pass down to our babies and our grandbabies. And we today have clients in 18 countries on 6 continents, spanning dozens of the world's languages and religions. And I feel really proud of that.
It's a real melting pot, you know. It's
Yeah.
interesting. You know,
Yeah.
it's funny. It's so hard because I think you really hit the nail right on the head with your experience with your mom, because it's like, oftentimes I'm like, it's so hard because I believe in equality, and you know, my whole life, it's just, I've not sort of fallen into the normal sort of ways of thinking, even of my family who, you know, but I guess like the thing that always gets me is like, I'm trying to hear from everybody's perspective and see how we could bring people, because a lot of people are just asking to be heard and be validated. But the one thing I think that like I've never really heard it never struck me as emotionally until right now, is where you said your mom's life wasn't valued, right?
Yeah.
And so like, and I'm going, what is my experience? Because I have some experience of being a white guy that will allow that, where people are like, there's privilege. And I've also had experiences where I didn't feel like there was anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But when you said that, it struck me that there's probably little chance in my life that somebody looked at me they may have not have valued me as a person, but they didn't disvalue me as a human being.
Yeah.
And it's like, I can almost not hold back the emotion right now because it's so, I think that hits the nail on the head for me.
It's true. And I feel really emotional too, thinking about it and saying it. And obviously been living this my whole life. I'll be 42 next month. And
Oh, man.
what I will say is that when you see a human and you understand the cumulative impact of this, because not only did my mother's life get cut incredibly short, she was only 27. I can remember when I turned 27 and
Right.
thinking my life is only beginning. Now at almost 42, I feel like my life is only beginning. And then not only was her life cut so short, but 4 children, and we have a 5th now from a different mom, but I still think of us as all one unit. So 5 children's lives were so deeply impacted by her absence. And my children will never know their grandmother. They only know her as a butterfly who comes to visit them. And the accumulation of that impact is so great. It could never be quantified. And all because somebody looked at her body and her face and saw her as less human than they were. And these kinds of things that we are having protests about today, and that we are having uprising about, and we are having important and heated and uncomfortable discussions about today, can only happen when one human being looks at another human being and doesn't see them as human as they are. Because if you see each other as equally human, chances are, if you're a decent, humane person, you cannot engage in these kinds of things. And what I want to really stress to people, because this conversation that we're having right now, Tom, is uncomfortable for a lot of people. What I want people to understand is that, number one, being willing to be and get uncomfortable is really important for our progress as individuals and as a society. And number two, that most of us don't have explicit, harmful biases and beliefs about other people. Most of us on the surface believe in equality. We believe that diversity is something that should be celebrated or at least not harmed. However, what I want people to understand is that every single one of us is prejudiced. And the reason why I say that with such certainty is not because of a judgment I'm making or my opinion. I'm speaking as a scientist who understands the neuroscience literature and other social and behavioral science literatures. And we know from mountains of research studies that the brain operates in a prejudiced manner. The brain has to take in huge amounts of information very rapidly and make decisions based on those pieces of information. And in order to do that, and to ensure our survival, which is first and foremost always the brain's priority, the brain uses what we call in science schema. Schema are mental shortcuts. One of the schema that we are all prone to using as human beings is the one that tells us to beware of people who look different from us, dissimilar others, people who are from other racial, ethnic, national backgrounds. And the reason why is because we have to remember that our brain and our body are the same brain and body that we have had for hundreds of thousands of years. And it's the same brain and body that our caveman ancestors and our cavewoman ancestors had in a time when we all lived very far apart from one another. If you saw someone who was from a different racial or ethnic or national group who looked different from you, it was usually a signal to you that there was danger, that there was the potential for threat, for war, for exposure to disease, that you weren't yet equipped to deal with because the immune system had not encountered it before, because each group of people in different regions had their own exposures.
Yeah.
Just like we're experiencing with coronavirus today, we don't have the immunity to it, or we hadn't had the immunity to it. That's why it has had such a profound and devastating impact on our population, especially certain vulnerable members of our population. So the brain is working hard to keep us safe. It does an exquisite job, but one of the shortcomings of that work that it does is that it makes us prone to prejudice. So we all have implicit biases, even when we believe in equality. You have them, I have them, even
For sure.
people with marginalized identities have them. And this is not something that you have to take my word for. You can actually assess this for yourself. There's something called the Implicit Attitudes Test. It's available at Harvard University online. If you just Google Harvard University Implicit Attitudes Test or Implicit Project, you can spend just a few minutes taking this test, and it will show you what your biases are and how strong they are. And you will see, because it's not about what you say you believe, it's about how your brain is processing information according to those schema that I spoke about. And so you will get to see for yourself that you have implicit biases. And so the reason why I say this is because I know that this conversation is uncomfortable for people, particularly those people who say, I'm not prejudiced, I believe in equality. And what I want us to all know is to have this foundational understanding that we are all prejudiced as human beings, because that's how our brains are designed. So let's start there and accept that, acknowledge that, look into our biases, see how strong they are, and work to figure out how to overcome them by learning how to intercept these primal, primitive responses, and so that they don't dictate our behavior, so that we can make rapid decisions that are as humane, as opposed to inhumane, as humane as we want to be and mean to be in our lives. Because the doctors who made poor decisions in an instant about my mother's care when she was in labor and dying as we were being born did not mean, I'm sure, I don't know them, but chances are they did not mean to be prejudiced toward my mother. They did not mean to undervalue her life. They were making rapid decisions, and they were making rapid decisions based on these biases that they held, that they had never interrogated or assessed, and that they had never been prompted to interrogate or assess, that were only fueled by subtle cues in the culture and in the environment since they were children, probably. And if we don't stop that process, that will continue into subsequent generations. But today, with what's happening, with the conversations we're having, we have this opportunity to intercept these processes that are happening in our brain and in our cumulative consciousness and our cumulative brain, to make sure that we're making enduring change once and for all.
Well, it sounds like what you're saying is that this is all a very natural protective mechanism that maybe back in the day we needed, and right now we might not need as much, and maybe we need a little, but it's inborn, so it's not so much whether it's there or not. So we should accept the fact that it's there, and then, like you said, look into it. But then the other part, I think it sounds like, is it's not really a choice of whether it's there or not. It's there. The choice is, what do you do with what you have? And right?
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly
And
right. It's the same, to draw a parallel, it's the same kind of primitive instinct for survival that our body has when it doesn't want to allow us to lose weight. If we try to deprive it of certain foods or of calories, it will go into these protective mechanisms. It will make us crave fatty foods, sugary foods. It will start to store fat from what we already have. It will do everything to resist, to protect us so that we survive and so that the species survives. It's the same sort of thing. And so we have to get really creative to overcome those thresholds that we're trying to get below if we want to get into a healthier BMI, for example. It's a similar kind of process from an evolutionary standpoint. So if we can all put aside the embarrassment that
Mm-hmm.
that we have prejudices and that we're so afraid to speak up because we're afraid of being perceived as prejudiced, and no, all agree that we have them, that we're going to speak up wobbly, imperfectly, clumsily, but that we are speaking up with the intention of coming together to create change, then we can create change more rapidly and at a systemic level, which is what we need and want to do.
The acknowledgement of that, though, I would think would sort of enlighten us, because like if you're constantly going, hey, I don't believe in this, but inside of you, it's kind of like you're duking it out inside of yourself. It's to say, hey, this is like, it's kind of cool to me, because COVID-19 has shown us that a lot of the things where we can prevent a bad outcome from getting exposed to a virus, as humans, we have a responsibility and a choice in diet, sleep, relaxation, exercise, all of these things. And the same thing, it's like this beautiful part about being a human being is we have this sort of additional mental faculty, but unfortunately that also, the challenge is it comes with responsibility. So it's beautiful that but we have to, that's the part we need to take. And I think that I'm starting to see so many people taking recognition of that responsibility. And, it reminds me of, because I grew up in a very Catholic family, and the sort of the very staunch Roman Catholic thing never sat with me, because I feel like the way we were behaving and what we were talking about were different. And then the people's interpretation of the Bible, I was like, whoa. So I don't know if you're familiar with Andy Newberg, but he's a neuroradiologist. I think it's at the University of Pennsylvania. And when I was first getting into yoga and meditation, I was reading these articles by him, and there's great stuff on his website. But he took people who were Franciscan nuns, women, who were sort of advanced, or whatever word you want to use. And when they went into prayer, God would speak to them. Mm-hmm. And then he got a group of advanced Buddhist meditators who were reported to be enlightened. Uh-huh. And so what was really cool is they had them do their prayer or their meditation, and they'd be sitting like in a room in the dark with a little fishing string on their pinky. And when they got to the height of their experience, they'd wiggle their pinky and they'd go and they put them in a functional MRI. And what they found out was, irregardless of whether you were a Franciscan nun listening to God speak to you, or a Buddhist monk who is experiencing connectedness with the entire unity of the universe, biochemically and physiologically in your brain, certain areas turned off and other areas turned on. They were identical. So to me, I'm like, religious tolerance. We can literally, what you bring in to your experience will cloud your experience, or will paint the picture for you in a little different way. Mm-hmm. And it reminded me of that.
It's interesting. Is natural. It is, and I'm not familiar with this work. I didn't know about these studies. But it makes me think of what we know from genetics research, which is that there's more genetic variability within races than between races. So just like if we could literally peer into—
Wait, hold on. Say that again. Everyone needs to hear that. This is science, everybody.
That was such a nerdy statement. Let me try to say that in another way.
That's perfect. I just want to make sure everybody hears it.
Yes. So from genetics research, we know something really important about our similarities and our differences, which is that there's more genetic variability or difference within races than between races, meaning that the difference in genetics is really an individual level factor. It's not a group level factor. Mm-hmm. So I think what's real, and it's interesting because Dr. Roseanne and I were having a conversation earlier about how to science-based strategies for speaking to our children about racism. And one of the things that she pointed out, and that what I just said about genetic variability also points out for us, is that if we look at our DNA through something like 23andMe, which is increasingly accessible,
Yeah.
people are often shocked to find that they have other racial and ethnic identities than they were aware of, and that you can look like you are exclusively Caucasian and have sub-Saharan African DNA or have Chinese DNA, for example. And so I think it's really important if we can remember, when we are thinking about our shared humanity and all being the same degree of human, and when we're thinking about our human and social responsibility to stand up and speak up, even for people who seem to be other than we are, that at our core, at the level of our DNA, we are not separate from one another. Just like when we look at how our brains function, we are not different from one another. The Catholics are not different from the Buddhists. Blacks are not different from whites. And I think if we can remember that, that changes everything. But it's not just remembering it in day-to-day life. It's enacting it in our words and our behaviors, so that the subtle cues and messages that we're sending to our children are ones that support this recognition of our shared humanity, because our children are absorbing this from us and from the world around them. And children are aware of race and racial differences as early as the age of 2, which is so shocking. And they're also aware that being lighter and being white is better, both children of color and white children, because even if they live in a progressive family in a progressive city, they are absorbing the messages. My daughter, from everywhere, these messages can be really, really subtle. What do you see on most books? What do you see in the toys? What do you see if you're watching your iPad? My daughter is gorgeous. Like, you could not dream up a more gorgeous human being. Like, she's literally going to be locked up until she's 35.
There you go. True story, though. She is.
She is. I mean, really, I'm like, she's going to have a nanny until she's 35. But she and I'm only sort of joking about that. She's so gorgeous. And yet, and she has a huge mane of beautiful curly hair. And she has said to me, I want flat hair. Can you straighten my hair?
Right.
It's so heartbreaking for me. And she does not learn that from me. I don't straighten my hair. We don't.
You don't hide. You're like out there, man. Let it go.
There. Exactly. Totally. And I wear it proudly, and I love my hair. And I tell her, you have the most amazing hair. But she somewhere is absorbing that message that society values girls with flat hair, as she calls it, more than with girls with hair like our hair. And so, again, we live in Los Angeles, and we are a super progressive family. My husband is very mixed. My kids are every race and ethnicity. They couldn't have a better environment in terms of being proud of who they are, what they look like, and also loving people. I'm so loving, my husband's so loving, my children speak multiple languages, they identify with lots of different kinds of people, and yet she's still absorbing that message somewhere. So I share that to point out, and hopefully she won't mind me having shared. She's only 5, and she'll hear this one day, and hopefully she doesn't mind my sharing it, and hopefully by the time she hears this, she loves her hair too. But I point this out to say that these messages are everywhere. They're like the air that we breathe. We cannot get away from them unless we are actively countering them. So even in a family like yours, Tom, or Dr. Roseanne's, and I'm just talking about amazing friends I have who I know are people who celebrate diversity, still, unless we are actively countering these stereotypes, we're not getting rid of them, and
Right.
our children are absorbing them. So if we want this poison to stop, and it is a form of poison, if we want this poison to stop with us, we have to actively counter it. And here's the question for everybody: now that we know that we're all prejudiced, now that we know that even if we're not saying anything biased, that our children, that we are absorbing the biases, and our children are absorbing the biases, and the only way that they go away and they stop with us is if we actively counter them and model this for our children so that they grow up in a different world. Here the question becomes, how do you commit to being willing to be uncomfortable enough to remember this day in and day out, and to actively counter this day in and day out, and to stay focused on the social responsibility when
Right.
it doesn't really affect you day in and day out? That's
You know,
really the question.
it is. And, I think you point out really tons of important things. And two things to really tease out is, one is we are so influential, not only on our children, but everyone around us.
Yes.
And they're all looking to each other, because most people are not leaders. Most people just want to remain comfortable, because that uncomfortable is a little hard.
Yes.
And, but even for everyone who has like a teenager who's like, yeah, I hate you now and I don't want to talk to you ever again,
Yes.
they're paying attention to what you're saying and you're doing. And it's like, I'm getting burned by this, because there's a couple of small habits I have that under stress, I might sort of vent to my wife a little bit. And my daughter's now 10.
Yes.
And certainly has noticed that that's a habit of mine. And she, it can talk about some of the things. And I'm like, well, that was venting. And then I was like, well, that's probably not something I should be venting,
Yes.
at least not in that setting. But so our kids are soaking this up. The other thing, though, I think is so important is, how do we figure out what uncomfortable is good? Because, like, for me, like, we were talking before we started recording about all the changes that we've both made recently so that we can get our message out to the world and help more. And I, as many people know, I took some uncomfortable steps and just put together these COVID-19 support summits. But it was fun and easy to, well, it wasn't easy to do, but it was fun to do. But it was like kind of putting your neck out there in a new way. But it was like that uncomfortable feeling that I felt, I knew that it was a positive uncomfortable. It was one where I felt myself, oh, do I put myself out in public like that? So to me, when I feel that, that means lean in. Yeah. Whereas the other side of it is, there's going to be things that you're about to do that are wrong and are bad. That's going to give you a much different feeling in your gut. And that's the one you leave alone. But you lean into the ones that make you feel uncomfortable, because it's a challenge and it makes you can think about your humanness. And it makes you confront your prejudice and change it. It makes you lead your child the right way, not the easy way, And so I think it's helpful for people to be able to have an indicator, to say, hey, this is uncomfortable, but uncomfortable, that's where you see the quantum changes, both in your life and in society.
100%. Tom, I think there's so much that's really important in what you just said. And what I want to underscore is, if you want progress in your life as an individual and in society, then stay committed to being uncomfortable, because that's what it takes, right? You and I have both, I've been in academia in a laboratory on the tenure track, where it's a big risk to put yourself out there, and you can be criticized for putting yourself out there. And you, in the same way, have had to take big risks to put yourself out there to help spread important messages and help people learn about innovative ways to take care of themselves, and which is what we do for fertility and pregnancy. We really believe in revolutionizing the way that we think about the biological clock and fertility, and we take care of them. And if we are too afraid to get uncomfortable and speak up, these things aren't going to change. Just like if we were too afraid to get uncomfortable and speak up, we would not be making these quantum leaps in our own lives and in our own mission. And I want to say something that I think isn't really obvious about progress, which is that one of the reasons why it's harder for people with marginalized identities and populations of color and people of color and women, all kinds of marginalized identities, to progress within their individual lifespans and intergenerationally, is because their critical resources, like their mental space, their energy, their effort, their attention, their time, get taken up with having difficult experiences that are often hard to interpret, hard to make sense of. So they're experiencing them, they're having to spend time processing them, preparing their children for them, sharing about them to help create change. Meanwhile, other people are focused on progressing, making money. And I want to point this out because this is part of the cumulative impact of having a marginalized identity. Not only are you having these experiences, but you're reliving the stress of them, and you're sharing about them to help create change. You're standing up, you're speaking up. All of this is taking away from your own health and well-being and your own progress. And that is not just impacting you as an individual, but it's impacting your family as a whole. It's impacting your family for generations to come. It's impacting you through epigenetic processes that get passed down to your children and grandchildren. And this is part of why there are social and cultural levels in the fertility triangle, in the fertility system that we address during the trimester and during pregnancy at the Fertility and Pregnancy Institute. This isn't just relevant for people with marginalized identities, but it's even more relevant for people with marginalized identities. So when we ask ourselves, well, isn't there something that they can do? Why can't they just work as hard as we are? When we ask those kinds of questions, we can't even see these invisible things that are happening that are blocking or at least slowing people's progress. And let me give you a concrete example of this, because I'm a highly accomplished woman, and my progress in my life has been stunted by these kinds of things. It has been an uphill battle in ways that it wouldn't have been an uphill battle if I looked differently. And the most immediate example that comes to mind for me is that I'm a professor, a tenured professor at one of the most prestigious private universities in the world. It's the 9th ranked private university. I was the first woman of color to be hired on the tenure track in the unit where I started at my university. That was in 2010, if you can believe it. Yeah. I was punished in many ways over and over and over again for being a young woman of color and for having the audacity to have baby after baby on the tenure track, because no serious scientist as we know it looks like me, and no serious scientist as we know it has 3 babies in 5 years on the tenure track.
Oh yeah. Nope.
And so this is just one example, of one very concrete example of how these processes operate in this very subtle way, but have really deep impacts on people.
But it's right in front of us too. It's like, like a lot of people are, well, you got there, right? And I'm like, but that's not the point, right? The whole friggin' time, it's like you were treated differently and your life was valued differently because of the way you looked. And I find myself, my nieces and nephew, their mom is my wife's, sister, and she's as white as I am, but their dad's from St. Thomas, and he's nearly as black as the couch in the background looks on my screen here. But so they're mixed, and I just, I don't hear a lot about the racism things, but I'm like, why do these things happen in their lives that wouldn't happen otherwise? And the beauty is they are in an area where there's a lot of racial integration. So they do have everybody's kind of mixing and everything, but you still see it's like insidious, it's to the point where for all I know, you know, there was stuff between mom and dad that, you know, like, you never know. And then
Yeah.
like, I remember growing up, my great aunt was, her language was very bigoted. I mean, it was very racist.
Yeah.
But she was talking in racist terms about a gentleman who lived down the road from them growing up. I mean, in the early 1900s, you know, as it was, but with love. And then I hear other people who are much younger than her speaking in the right words, but there's hate in their heart. And I'm just like, we have got to move to a new level here. And it just, yeah. So one of the things you keep talking about in the work that you do, and I love hearing about it, is genetics. And then you threw in the word epigenetics, which just that actually makes my heart sing, because there's a chance to change what has already happened, what is happening, and what is going to happen. So why don't you tell me a little bit about what you're doing with that?
I love that so much. So this is so important. If you hear the term epigenetics and you're like, what is that? It's just a fancy scientific term, which literally means above the genes. And what it means is that we can affect the way our genes express themselves. So we can't change the DNA that we were given, but we can affect the quality of our gene expression, how our genes express themselves, which is one of the things that's involved in the aging process. So when you see someone who looks like they're aging at a very fast rate versus someone who looks like they're aging much more gracefully at a slower rate, it probably has to do not just with their genes, because your genes are not your destiny, but their epigenetics and how the way that they live and the external environment that they're exposed to and the internal environment that they're exposed to, their psychological hygiene, the way they tend to talk to themselves, are how that's affecting the expression of their genes. And the stress process is a huge part of this. And so one of the foundational things that we do in the trimester when people come to us because they want to prepare for pregnancy and just what we call having their super baby, which it doesn't mean your baby is better than someone else's. It means you getting to have your super baby, the healthiest, happiest, brightest, most well-adjusted baby you can possibly have. And if they're coming to us because they're having fertility challenges, we work at the level of epigenetics at these 5 levels of the fertility triangle. We think of fertility and the biological clock as a complex system or network, kind of like the neural network in the brain or a cell phone network, if you can picture that. And so it's this complex system or network, but it has 5 hubs. And the 5 hubs are psychosexual. The next one is bioecological, which has to do with physiology and then the ecological context, both the external and internal environment. The next one is neuroimmunology, which has to do with the brain and the immune system. And then the social and cultural levels. Those are the 5 hubs of the fertility system, or the fertility triangle as we represent it. And at each of those levels, we are working on creating positive epigenetic change. And we talk a lot, we hear more and more in our society about intergenerational stress and intergenerational trauma, how these things are passed down from one generation to another through how they become embedded in our biology and in our genes through epigenetic expression. But we also have the potential for intergenerational bliss, for creating this health and well-being that creates this domino effect across generations. That's what we're working on doing in the trimester, essentially. We are reversing reproductive aging, we're igniting fertility, we're reducing risk of miscarriage and chromosomal abnormalities and other kinds of pregnancy complications. And we are optimizing the likelihood that you get to have your super baby. And in the process, we are putting in the bliss that can cross generations too, and helping to intercept those processes of stress and trauma so that we can be aware of them and so that they can stop with us. They don't have to keep being passed down across generations. Just
Yeah.
like what we've been talking about racism and bias and systemic discrimination. It's a similar kind of process, just at the genetic level.
Well, and it's interesting because so you're saying you can optimize someone's health, optimize the expression of their genes so that when you work with the couple, I'm assuming that everyone's involved, not just one half, but then we're able to optimize the transmission of our genes that are now optimally functioning. And
Yeah,
now we have this chance for this child to have this optimal, experience of being born and being born into a conscious environment, which I think is incredible. And some of the work that I've seen on epigenetics is really interesting, is because especially from the emotional and psychological perspective, if you're holding on to things from before, you
mhm,
can work on things in previous generations or with your relationship with people in previous generations. And that will change other people in your family who have not known you've done the work. So we can literally go back in time and change how epigenetics allow our genetics to be expressed in people who are related to us. And they've looked at this, in Jews who have went through the Holocaust
mhm,
and their families. And it's interesting. I'm thinking about my father and I had a rocky time. It was
mhm,
we, before he died and before he got Alzheimer's.
mhm.
Um, Before we had kind of put things together and patched our
Oh,
relationship,
good.
but
I'm so glad.
what's really interesting, Cleopatra, is I was on a brunch call with Jack Canfield a couple, like a month and a half ago. It's
Yeah,
just
oh,
he was doing
I
something.
missed that one. I was supposed to be there. Yeah.
Oh, it was so good, and it was just but I was sitting there and I go, you know what? I am so blessed because I realize now that my father was trying his best. But the
Mm-hmm.
difference between him and I was I had more tools available to me. I created an environment where I had more tools than he did. So outwardly what he did was good, but it wasn't great. And I, as the one going through it, wanted a lot more. And I would say it
Yeah.
was bad.
Yeah.
However, I can see that he tried with all the resources he had as hard as he could. Now that it's just this, there's so much reflection with COVID-19 going on, and I'm like, domino effect of positive things where I'm going, my dad tried hard to change the way he viewed the world and the way he treated others around him, and he made as much change as he could with his resources.
Yes.
Now I'm not just doing this for me, I'm doing this for me and to allow him to heal and allow his father and the rest of their family to heal, because there's a very strong familial component. So it's inspired me to do even more. And
Mhm.
hearing you, I'm just this is
Yes.
change. It's almost what is it? Gandhi said something along the lines of be the change you want to be in the world, you want to see in the world.
100%. 100%. I think that is so powerful. And Tom, I just want to say that what you recognize here is that, and I have recognized something similar about my dad who passed away a couple of years ago from something that looked a lot like COVID, actually, like we're seeing
Wow.
in the elderly. And is that people generally are doing the very best that they can, given the circumstances they were faced with and the tools they have to cope with those circumstances.
Right.
In fact, that's the definition of stress, right? That the demands that we perceive exceed the resources that we have to cope with them. And if we are blessed enough, the resources that we have, both financial, emotional, otherwise, continue to grow with each generation. So it takes a lot more to stress us epigenetically and otherwise.
Right.
But if we can remember that most people are doing the very best that they can with the resources that they have, then it really changes how we respond to the things that we experience with other people. And it's so powerful to do that work, to heal
Right.
ourselves, to heal generations back, and to heal generations forward. I'm a huge fan of Kundalini yoga and meditation.
Mm.
I studied with Gurmukh when I went to study with her when I was 25. And I wanted to round out the scientific perspectives in my trimester protocol, which is the at-home system that we use to help people prepare for pregnancy and overcome fertility challenges and create this epigenetic change that will reverse overall aging, but specifically reproductive aging, because we're working with a lot of women having children in their 30s and 40s. And in the Kundalini tradition, they believe that everything that we do to heal is healing 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. And from a scientific perspective, my own studies have shown that the impacts in the trimester and during pregnancy that we experience, both positive and negative, span at least 2 generations, and probably more, just that we don't generally have the luxury of studying
all that,
2 generations. So it is really, really powerful. And to know it, what you said reminds me a lot of my husband and I are super deliberate about obviously how we go into having children and the family culture that we create. And one of our mottos is be in appreciation, but stay hungry. And it feels to me a lot like what you said, which is I can be at peace with what I experienced with my dad, be in appreciation for what he was able to do, and still be hungry and want more for myself and for my daughter, my children, and expect more because I know better, so I can do better, right? And that to me is hugely important, because the longer we hold on to that pain and the resentment and the feeling of having been deprived or sold short in some way, we're just reliving that stress in our brain and in our body, and it's harming us.
Right. Well, and I think that people don't think we've been trained. I mean, like, one of our core values in our family, at least between Jill and I, is to not domesticate our daughter. Yes. Right? We want to keep her safe, and we want to teach her how to live in the world, but we don't want her to be the best our daughter possible. Yes. We want her to be Talia. We want her to grow into who she is.
Love that.
Right? And it's like, but I recognize that so many of the ways I behave I learned from those around me, because everyone around us is very influential over us. And, so it's just an interesting thing to try to make sure that we provide the space for that, and a lot of what you were talking about also reminds me of looking at the humanity of others, and also turning that mirror on ourselves and that lens and giving ourselves a break. And it's like, I just find myself wanting to say, the actions of people, that there are wrong actions, right? And so we may not agree. We don't have to agree with what they did, but we can also see them as a human being at the same time who did something wrong, which is different than just grossly generalizing them as a bad person. And again, like, I know that's going to hurt a lot, but for some people, and I can even feel it kind of doing one of these in my chest, but I want to speak the truth and say, look, if we want to make that quantum leap, we need to do something different. If you're just doing the comfortable everyday thing, you're going to get the comfortable everyday thing. And realistically, most people's, their everydays are okay, but there's a lot more discomfort than they want.
Yes. And there's a lot more discomfort than they want, and there's not nearly as much being the fullest expression of themselves as they would like. I think most people, I mean, if you look at the studies of the dying, most people have regrets about the extent to which they were able to fully express themselves in their love and live their lives. And I don't know about you, but I really don't want to be one of those people. I mean, my mother did not die to give me life for me to just be sort of halfway alive and living here. And so I'm here to like shake it up, and I'm okay with that. And one of the things that will be the biggest quantum leap for any and everyone is to start with their own thoughts. And here's why. Most people who can figure out how to be loving toward themselves in their own thoughts will automatically be loving to other people. It's people who are deeply unsettled within themselves who are usually the ones who are out there in the world causing harm, whether they mean to or not, to other people. And we have approximately somewhere between 60 and 80 thoughts per day, which is about 2,500 thoughts per hour, 3,000 thoughts per hour, and 80% of them are negative. So if we could figure out how to start with radically changing the way that we think and talk to ourselves internally, we could create huge change in ourselves, in our families, in our communities, in our societies. And, in the Prime Minister protocol, we spend a lot of time working on thoughts and what we believe is possible for us and our fertility and our reproductive potential based on our age and statistics and what doctors have told us and diagnoses of infertility, which, by the way, I never use that word because only 3% of the population is truly sterile or infertile. So why would we go around identifying that way when for the vast majority of people that label is actually completely untrue? And yet if you get that diagnosis, you internalize it, you identify with it, and it's hard to let it go and overcome that limitation on what's possible for you and for your family. And so if we want to revolutionize our lives, and we think we need to look a certain way, have a certain amount of money in the bank, have a certain partner, this or that, really what we all need, and the first place to begin is to start with our thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. You remind me of when I try to help people make a dietary shift, because a lot of people are on a standard American diet but they're hearing that they need to make change, but it's hard, right? I think I had gluten every meal, every snack, and every envelope I licked from the time I was born till the time I was 27, right?
Yeah.
But what's interesting is I found that it's really hard to remove things. Mm-hmm. But it's easier a lot of times to get people to buy into adding something. So maybe instead of removing the sugar first or the gluten, we're going to add in some green leafies, and then we can start to feel a little bit better, and then have some success, and then start to remove, because that's a lot harder, right? But what I'm hearing you say is that we need to consciously create our day and consciously create a situation where we're adding positive thoughts, because the negative thoughts are ones that are protective, right? But let's not fight the fact that they're there. Like, it's not that, I'm a bad person because I'm having bad thoughts. No. Scientifically, that's normal. So let's spend the time to set out a program where, like your program, where you're actually putting the positive thoughts in.
Mm-hmm. I think that is so beautifully important. And there are so many mechanisms through which adding in as opposed to taking away can be really useful. If you think about the example of food that you gave, once you start adding green leafy vegetables in, you might be more full, you start to feel better, you start to be more mindful of what you're eating, and you start to notice when you make space for the sugar instead of for the green vegetables that you don't feel as well, or your brain isn't as alert. And so that is a really powerful way to look at doing things. And you're right, in terms of our thoughts and having negative thoughts, it's the same kind of process that makes us have prejudice and implicit bias toward other people. The brain is constantly scanning the environment for potential threats. And so it attends much more readily to negative information. It sees the negative first and foremost. And so it's not that you're bad if you have those thoughts, but you want, as much as possible, notice them, intercept them.
What do you do with that negative thought?
Exactly. Consciously take time to have positive thoughts, to affirm positive thoughts. And I think that when you hear these things like positive thinking and affirmation, and we talk a lot about pleasure. One of our mantras in the Prime Minister protocol is, as many moments of every day, step out of stress, out of emergency, and out of trauma, and be in peace and in pleasure. And here's why. The brain, again, is designed so beautifully and so brilliantly that it will prioritize our survival above and beyond everything else. And that includes reproduction, which in terms of resource allocation is very costly. So if the brain and body perceive a threat because you're under tremendous stress, you're in fight or flight mode, there's an emergency, you're in trauma, you're reliving old traumas, you're experiencing new trauma, what happens is that it's much harder to get and stay pregnant because the brain is putting reproduction, bless you, on the back burner, and it's prioritizing your survival for your
Right.
safety, right? And so we can think of words like peace and pleasure and positive thinking and affirmation as like, oh, that's cute, that's nice, that sounds fun.
Right.
And years ago, I might have been someone who thought that too. Like, I'm over here surviving, trying to move forward, trying to work for this big mission that I have.
Right. You got to get on the
time?
tenure.
Who has time? Who has time for pleasure, for example? But I always say, there's a quote that is, treat pleasure as if your life depends on it. It does. And I always say, in parallel, treat pleasure as if your fertility depends on it. It does. And
right.
these are not cute optional things. These are matters of life and death. And so it's really important.
It really makes me think about, like, it's in chronic illness treatment, I'm doing a lot of counseling between parents and their children, or couples therapy, like, you know, and it's really interesting that so many people who have some sort of chronic situation in their life, you start talking, getting to know them, and they're like, I'm like, do you spend time for pleasure? Because it's almost like they can't, it's like everybody, not everybody, most people will still tell me I love my spouse, but it's just, bleh. I'm like,
Yes.
do you understand that you actually have to make time for pleasure? And it's like, it's like, why have we become so, it's weird that this word, what I was going to say, we've made like our lives so sterile. And TV and social media has gotten so risque, and it's like you can see the pleasure, but I mean, man, have pleasure in your life, your partner.
Yes, yes. It's so true. It's
feel alive.
Yeah, feeling alive is almost always the answer to everything, right? And I mean that in a positive, constructive way. I don't mean it in a reckless way, but we have to feel alive. We have to feel free to be the fullest expression of ourselves. And we all need to feel safe, number one, in order to feel free to be the fullest expression of ourselves. And we all have a right to have that experience.
Safety.
Yeah. Yes. It's everything.
It's so good. And, you know, it's interesting. It's crazy. I've had so many conversations during this COVID-19 thing where people are like, well, how do I prevent a really bad outcome? How can I prevent getting the virus? What if the second wave comes? And I'm like, well, you can do these basic steps, which include, you know, optimizing sleep, optimizing your diet. And then we talk about and then the hormonal changes that occur with that, and immune support. Then we talk about breathing and relaxation and all the benefits of that, and how that can bring down inflammation, improve it, you know, immune function, all of these things. And then I'm like, but, you know, it's really interesting that the same thing, if you ask me the same question on how to get better from chronic Lyme disease or help your kid recover from PANS, or better yet, prevent something down the line, same answer.
And fertility and pregnancy.
Yes.
A lot of the same answers, right? There are a lot of nuances about hormones and fertile days and specific conditions, but at the root, it is all the same. And guess what? You could have all of the resources, all of the best technologies, and if you're not finding a way to be in peace and be in pleasure, to love yourself, to feel settled in who you are and in your own life, then all of this other stuff is kind of just going through the motions.
Right. And we're harnessing the power of this amazing body that life has given us, right?
Yes.
And I'm just thinking, like, coronavirus is a weird time, right? And it's like, as somebody who's, whole career has been treating chronic infections, I mean, it was like, I was like, well, one, you saw it, you knew it was coming at some point.
Yes.
But what's really cool about this, and I always like, I'm not saying I dismiss like I was saying earlier, I'm not dismissing the bad, but I am also choosing to find a positive point in here.
Yeah.
Because I know people in their early 30s who are no longer here from getting COVID-19. And would that have happened with influenza? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But there have been some bad things. But what I've also seen is so many people have taken to doing things in their lives, making a personal change that has a greater positive impact on other people than themselves. Putting on a mask doesn't protect me. It protects everybody else from me.
Yeah.
And so what I'm hoping is that when people hear what we've been talking about and see what's been going on with all, with everything that's been going on with the Black Lives Matter movement and all the racism that's come on the front pages to say there are a lot of bad things there, but this is also a time when humanity is coming together in an unprecedented way to move forward together and to actually create equality. And I hope that we can see that in humans. It's like we do have this innately within us to take that extra step that makes us human and get past all the things you pointed out, like the thought patterns that are ingrained for safety, and choose to step forward together and to really lift up. And maybe I'm not for equality. What I'm for is everybody helping everybody go up even more than we are, so that everybody on the very bottom to the top, the current top, can rise up higher together.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that so much. And I couldn't agree with you more. And look, we are human. We have shortcomings that come with being human, but we have the power and the capability to do so much when we're really committed to something. And I think that this moment is an opportunity to do just that. And I was listening to President Obama speak the other day, and he said something that I thought was really telling. He said, the protests that are happening today, the demographics of them are very different than protests we've seen in other times, that there's much more representation of other groups who are not necessarily the groups directly affected by the reasons underlying the protests. And that has given him such a great sense of hope and optimism for the future. And everything that is happening, if this is the moment that true and lasting change occurs, then this moment, as hard as it's been, has also created a beautiful opportunity for us to move forward and to never look back.
Oh, so well said, Cleopatra. I mean, it's just, it's funny. I'm like, there's always a good time to stop, but then there's always a good time to continue, because like you're inspiring me so much. And you just reminded me, that I have like as I'm in my 40s too. And I'm just kind of like, there was this bit where you sort of get frustrated with the generations behind us, and and you hear all the criticism of millennials, but then there's other creativity and all this other stuff. But I have to say, this is an interesting time, because I was on the phone with one of the moms, and I see many of the people in the family as a family practitioner, but she had a 19-year-old and a 21-year-old or a 22-year-old, both girls, very white, and they were like, she's like, they want to go to Hartford and protest, but I'm afraid for their safety. But they're adults, but they want to do it. It's so important. And then she just said, wait, we all need to go. And it's like, these are, because she said, her kids said, this is not going to happen in the world I live in, and it can't. And, it's so invigorating. And I feel so much hope for my daughter, who's 10, right? And that's like the thing. It's just like, it's okay for me, things will happen, but like a good parent, I always want more for her and everyone around her. But it is inspiring, when you see people stepping up. And it's just like, the other thing we were talking about right before we came on is like, I love your Facebook cover with you and Oprah. And I'm like, my daughter's this little girl, and I'm just like, the world is so shitty, right? It's just like, but I'm like, where are the powerful women to lead, because I'm like a guy. What can I show her? I could be a loving guy, but I want her to have positive role models outside just her mom, who are women who are making a huge difference and inspire her to do that. And it's like, I right before you get on, I'm like, oh, there's you and Oprah. I mean, talk about two Black women who are killing it, and inspiring millions.
And it's true, when it's been a dream of mine to meet Oprah. She's been such an inspiration in my life. And it was just 2 or 3 months ago that I got to meet her. And you can see in our photo, like, we hugged so many times. It was such a beautiful experience. And I told her I wasn't allowed to watch TV growing up. My dad was very strict. And so I didn't watch your show growing up, but I knew that you existed, and I knew that you were making a difference in the world, and that you were full of optimism, and just knowing that you were there and that you looked the way you did and you were able to do the things that you were able to do were so inspiring to me and gave me so much hope for my future, even when my immediate surroundings were very difficult. And because of that, your presence in the world has meant everything to me. And it is those symbolic measures to elevate our world and all groups of people make such a difference for young people. And it's just like we were saying, those subtle cues are so important. And for me, she was maybe a not so subtle cue that there was so much more that was possible for me than the things that I could see right in front of me, and that the things that people said were possible for me. And I have to tell you that the way I survived being on the tenure track as the only woman of color, the only person of color, was that I learned that the things that people say are and are not possible for you are only true if you believe them.
So well said. Oh my God. It is. And it's like, put your mind on what you want to achieve and start feeling the emotion of that achievement today, and the universe will bring it to you. And I mean, the thing that I hear is, like, I hear what you're doing at the Fertility and Pregnancy Institute is also showing that other people, that what was possible for Oprah and what was possible for Cleopatra, is possible for them and for their children.
100%. 100%. I got pregnant on the first try with each of my 3 super babies, and I had them. I'm an older mom, like most of our clients, not all of them. We have some people in their 20s, but most of them are in their 30s and 40s. I was almost 35, 37, and 40 when my babies were born. I planned for them all to be born in March in the same month. I mean, these things, I'm just like you. These things are possible for you, even when the normal curve of the data say that after 35 or after 40, it's going to be really hard to get pregnant and have an amazing baby. You can deliberately shape your fertility. You can deliberately shape the foundation that you give to your children through this epigenetic work that you do. You can deliberately shape the culture of your family and what's possible for you. And that's what we do every single day. And it is, I think it is, I didn't realize that part of my work was just that I was going to be an example, but certainly I live what I teach. And it is a powerful example. It's just like me with Oprah, and also one of my mentors, Dr. Carrie Ann Rockamore, who is a woman who looks like me, who was a tenured professor, who became an entrepreneur. And seeing them made what I dreamt of felt closer to my reach. And that changes everything for you. And so it is true that part of what we are doing at the Fertility and Pregnancy Institute, even though that's not what we meant to do, was to show people that having both the life and the family of their dreams as overachieving women, ambitious women who are having children later in life is possible for them.
Yeah.
And it's everything.
It is, it's so funny because, like, people need to know that it's possible,
Yes.
and they need to see it. And like in what I do, a lot of adults come in, they've read a lot on Dr. Google and Facebook and all this stuff where it says, hey, you know what? You can't get better from chronic Lyme disease. And I'm like, well, I did, and I had
Yes.
babesiosis and heavy metal toxicity, and I'm great, right? And you can do
Yes.
what they're like, really? You had it? And I was like, well, yeah. And
Yes.
what's really interesting is it's like people are just, what we get in the news is more focused on that negative and the lack of possibility because it sells well because of our innate protective measures.
It's
So
true. So true.
and then like I'm just hearing like the way you're like I'm showing people it's possible and I'm leading them by example, and I'm like, wait, but that's what I do too.
It's
That's,
so true.
and the cool part is then you get to go home and you go, you know what? I don't need to be Oprah or Cleopatra, and maybe I have two first names instead of one, and maybe I have to have my last name in there for people to know who the hell I am, but like me, you know. But it's like, you know, you can do this in your own life and in the lives of the people around you. You don't have to have the lofty goal of owning your own television network. Like, how many people do
Yes.
that?
Yes, it's so true. Well, and Tom, I think you're saying something really important, which is that one of the blessings of the way that our society is so interconnected, and specifically social media, is that we get to see more about our future selves and what's possible. But we also get to engage in things that can be harmful, like social comparison. And that again
Mm-hmm.
is another natural human tendency, but that can be really harmful to our self-esteem, our sense of well-being, our mental health. And so again, let's take the good and try as much as possible to leave aside that which isn't constructive or productive. So go and see what's possible, and then focus on you and focus on your life and your family and how you can apply it to yourself and your family, and being the very best Tom, Cleopatra, Oprah version of you that you can possibly be. And so, so engaging in social comparison that is harming us is one of those ways that our thoughts can become really fixated on the negative. I'll never have that. That will never be possible for me. What about, wow, I see what Oprah has done. I saw what Dr. Carrie Ann Rockamore did. They look kind of like me.
Yeah.
That's possible for me too, if I'm willing to work hard enough for it.
Well, and it's the possibility of what you want in your life. You know, it's like, I think it's
Yes.
interesting as I've hung out with people to help me learn how to be more effective as a physician and be more effective in getting my message out. I find that some people really want that big, you know, people that they want some recognition. They
Yeah.
want to help 1 billion people or 10 million people. And then there's other people who they want to help a lot of people, but they want to focus on family and carving out. And it's like every single person does it a little different, and they do it in their unique flavor. And it was interesting, as you're talking about social comparison, I was like, the reason that I compare myself to somebody else is to, you know, kind of friend or foe, but it is naturally protective. And so if I say, well,
It is.
I can't have that, or that's only for people like them, it makes us separate and it keeps me in my small area of safety. So maybe if I want something a little different, I should say, hey, that's something uncomfortable, and it's correct. It's not a wrong thing to want. So then I'm going to lean into that a lot and see what happens. It's so interesting how it's all interconnected.
It is all interconnected. And at the end of the day, it's about pushing our comfort zone, whatever our own comfort zone is, to be able to achieve the best version of ourselves that we see for ourselves.
So great. Well, and thank you so much. I mean, this is so amazing to talk. And I hope that everyone listening is inspired to really move beyond where you are today and to help society lift everyone up,
Yes.
you know, to this higher level, way beyond where we are today.
Yes, and it is possible for us. It is possible for us. Dr. Tom, thank you so much for having this incredible conversation that we all need to be having, and creating the space for doing that. And just in general, being this bright light, creating this conversation of how to be our next level selves in every way. Thank you so much for what you do in the world.
You're so welcome, and thanks for making the time to be a part of it. And one last thing, I do want to make sure if anybody needs to reach out, get in touch with you, might want to learn more about your work, or may say, hey, I need some of what Dr. Cleopatra is doing. Where can they find more about you?
Yes, absolutely. We're at fertilitypregnancy.org, and we have an amazing fertility checklist. We'll teach you things about your fertility that you've never known before. You can download that for free right there at fertilitypregnancy.org and stay connected that way.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm probably going to download it too. I don't plan on getting pregnant myself anytime soon, but seriously, I mean, these are things that are going to help in all of our lives. So 100%. Thank you so much for sharing them.
Yes, download it, enjoy. It's wonderful.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, and we'll do it again soon.
I'd love to. Thank you.